Could you take your seats, please? We're going to start in a moment. So, welcome, everybody, to our She for He event. My name is David Shackleton. I'm the president of the local branch of CAFE, Canadian Association for Equality. Our slogan is "Equality means equality for everyone." And we tend to focus our attention on men at the moment, simply because they're the ones who get left out of the focus a lot of the time when gender is considered. I want to tell you that we're presently raising money for a men's center, a center for men and families in Ottawa that we hope to open this fall. We're doing well. We've got about $40,000 towards our goal of $75,000. There is a donation bucket at the admissions table if anybody is able to contribute. And we are a registered charity. You can get a tax receipt for your donation if you just fill out a form that gives us your name and address and the amount that you're contributing. So this event tonight is called She for He. Now, the name comes from the He for She program that is being run by the United Nations. In 2015, Emma Watson, who was the actor who played Hermione in the Harry Potter movies, made an address to the United Nations about gender issues. And it started really well. She talked about how men have issues and women have issues. And certainly that's true. But then when it came to the time to actually announce the program that was going forward, the men's issues were forgotten, and the program was he for she. In other words, men would ignore their own issues and support women's issues under this program. So we thought we'd turn that around this evening. We are certainly completely in agreement with the legitimacy of women's issues, but that's not our focus tonight. Tonight our focus is men's issues. So I want to introduce men's issues. Many women, perhaps most women, don't realize how powerful they are in the psyches of men. I suspect that most men took for granted the validation they received from women for being good men. From their wives and mothers, their sisters and girlfriends. That is, until it stopped. The general indictment of men, of all men, but especially white, heterosexual Western men, that came from identity politics and feminism in particular, starting in the 60s, has been devastating to men. Patriarchy, a male word, has come to stand for everything that is wrong and unjust and oppressive in the world, in the past and today. Feminism, a female word, has come to stand for everything that is just and fair and right. We men hide our pain because that's what men are taught to do, but you can see it if you look for it. It's in the rates of male suicide and substance abuse, in the rates of health problems like depression, homelessness, and especially in the anger of men's rights advocates. It's not easy to recover from this indictment of men, to really get that it is unjust, to take back the power that women have had in the psyches of men. That journey began for me over 20 years ago, and it isn't finished yet. But something that can help with this journey is to realize that some women get it. Some women, far from indicting men as responsible for all the ills of the world, want to honor them as worthy and fully equal partners with whom to share the journey of life. So that's the reason that CAFE Ottawa is holding this event. It may be the most important that we've ever held. Tonight you'll hear from 4 women who love men, who respect their achievements, and who want to help them to recover their honor in the world. Engage fully with them. Don't miss the opportunity to hear their message and really take it in. What you will hear tonight, unlike what you hear daily from our national media and contemporary culture, is the truth about men. What you will hear tonight is women acknowledging the reality and the legitimacy, indeed the equivalency, of men's issues. And for women, let this be a celebration of your power in the lives of men, which fully balances the power of men in women's lives. Let it be a gift of healing, long withheld and denied by those consumed with their own pain. Let it be the beginning of a greater trust and intimacy between men and women, as we seek to heal the damage done by 50 years of mistaken grievance politics. So that's what we're about tonight. Let me start by introducing Jen Crawford, on my left, who will be the moderator for this event. Ms. Crawford is the Executive Director of Center 454, which is a day center serving people who are precariously housed or homeless in the Ottawa area. Most of them are men. It is operated as a community ministry by the Anglican Diocese of Ottawa. As you will hear from Ms. Crawford, her work with Center 454 and previously with the Ottawa Mission Men's Homeless Shelter have made her familiar with a number of men's issues. So please welcome Jen Crawford.
Thank you. First, I want to thank Dave and John for inviting me to be part of it, of this discussion. We had a talk yesterday morning, and I wasn't quite prepared to talk about why I would absolutely say yes to being part of this, but I think the bit that we talked about yesterday, it's ringing clearer and clearer in my mind on why I would want to be here. For almost 20 years, I've been frontline working predominantly with men who are faced with poverty, who are faced with mental illness, who are faced with addiction. And when I thought about it, I'll be honest, last night I sat down and really thought about it. And I thought, wow, a lot of the folks that we serve aren't even sure what those barriers are that are in place because they are so ingrained and so part of a system that they are living in. And one of the things I realized working through frontline work and then eventually into some, as I am now looking after the center and creating programs and such that being a frontline worker, I wasn't even aware of what I could do to help work through these systematic barriers that a lot of the men that we face and talk to every day. I would say that almost 100% of the folks that come through our doors, their issues started with trauma at youth, or in their childhood, family breakdown, and the cone of silence that surrounds so many of the folks that we see every single day is impenetrable sometimes. And sometimes our hands are tied as helpers. We want to do more, but we're at a loss at who to turn to and where to go and the support that the folks need, because these issues aren't at top of mind for many people, and even in social work, in social advocacy, and social justice, they're just not. So I just want to say as well, the idea of opening a center for men and families in Ottawa, you can count on referrals from us, you can count on support from us. And I'm just grateful that I can be here, and I hope that I'm here to talk with anyone after as well. I don't want to take up too much time, I'm just moderating, but I just want you guys to know that I am in full support, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing what the ladies have to say. So first I'm going to introduce Maria Al-Masani. Maria is an Arab-Canadian women's rights activist and Arab Spring revolutionary who was distinguished as a CNN agent of change. Al-Masani worked at the Parliament of Canada for the NDP and the Liberal parties. She was also the first Yemeni at the Miss Universe pageant, and now works as a jewelry designer for Al-Masani Royal Jewelry that promotes fashion that empowers women. So, welcome.
Thank you. The best way for me to validate men's issues is to tell my own story, how university feminism that I studied led me to attempting suicide. So, you're not alone. Just realize that. The system is messed up, and yes, it's rigged against men deliberately, and I will go into that, and why this is not healthy for anyone in society. You're not alone. Also, there's a politician, Maxime Bernier, he talked about the red pill in his platform. So call his office tomorrow and tell his office your issue, demand your issues in his platform. So next, how did feminism lead me to suicide? Feminism, I divide in two categories. Feminism until 1963, I call neurotypical feminism. It's culturally Christian, and it's about achieving equality, which ended with the Equal Work for the Equal Pay Act. And after that, the neurotypical feminists went home. The post-1963 feminism, I like to call neurotic feminism, which I thought was, after my journey to mental health, was an inadvertent proselytization of mental illness. How so? Well, having been mentally ill temporarily, mental illness is not some crazy psycho killer at night. Most people are highly functional. It's like an optimist sees a glass half full, a pessimist sees a glass half empty, and a feminist sees this as the fault of patriarchy. Well, actually, to go on to mental health, a healthy person will see the glass half full, see opportunities in life, and then pursue the opportunities, and that the benefits from that create positive life outcomes. Whereas a pessimist will feel, oh, the glass is half empty, I'm so sad, and then why should I work harder, then get fired from their job, and that validates one thing after another, and that snowball effect, that's called depression. So a person who suffers from mental health issues can look like they're very functional, but when it comes to research, it affects the research questions you pick, right? And it reflects your answers, right? So, how did I get there? Well, how did I get to killing myself? The fun part of the story, right? Probably not for me, but. So, I got to killing myself. I mean, I survived, so I'm here. But I tried. Well, first, I was happy and healthy in Yemen. I lived in the Middle East. It was a Muslim country. I lived through the civil war there. I survived. Also, a group of 6 armed men came into my house. I was 14. I kicked their ass. I kicked them out. I don't like burglars. Burglars learned to fear my name. I was really, I was really happy. I came here, studied university, went to study economics, was a good girl, and that's where the problem started. So in university, they taught us Marxist critique, then feminist critique. The feminist critique they taught us was really Marxism for women, or in other words, how to screw men over. So the Marxist critique we're taught in every class is everything is the fault of capitalism, no personal responsibility. Life will be better if the workers have a dictatorship over the capitalists and screw them over, right? Then we learned feminist critique in every class as well, which is everything is the fault of patriarchy. So, burp, your fault. Yeah, I don't take personal responsibility, it's all your fault. I mean, it's really leads to learned helplessness and mental illness. This is not healthy. Anyway, so everything is all your fault, it's the fault of patriarchy. By the way, patriarchy is also the name of the Russian Orthodox Church who persecuted the Jews in the pogroms, and many of whom later developed the feminist philosophy. That being said, everything is the fault of patriarchy, and life will be better if we have a dictatorship of women workers over the man capitalists. Actually, that's not how life works, but that basically teaches people learned helplessness to blame others for their problems, having an external locus of control. So what is PTSD, or post-traumatic stress disorder? It's trauma plus helplessness. So this feminism I was taught in university is dangerous. By giving all the students learned helplessness, one little trauma, and they get the same nasty PTSD somebody gets in a war zone fighting in Iraq, which is exactly what happened to me. So at 22, second year in Canada, I was sexually harassed in the parliament. So what I went is I discreetly went to my boss and I asked them, can you change my office? I don't get along with the supervisor, right? And so I got fired for that. And I was just politely asking, you know, it's really hard, can I just change offices? Then my supervisor, it was the Liberal Party, and his boss, who I went to, is a female feminist. So yeah, hypocrites. They falsely accused me of a bunch of things that I never did. And not only I lost my job, for a long time I couldn't work on the Hill again. So for me, that was a huge shock. So now when I hear believe women, I fight against that. I'm like, if somebody is falsely accused, that is like the worst feeling in the world. I've been there. So when after I was falsely accused, then I was a good girl, right? Remember what I studied in university? Blaming men, it's all your fault, right? And blaming capitalism, blaming the white man, so on. Blaming others drove me sick, so I tried to kill myself. And then the best thing ever happened to me. I ended up at the hospital. Well, not the best thing. Well, the best thing after the hospital was I found dialectical behavioral therapy, and I got my health back. And now I'm happily married, my husband's here, and I have a jewelry company, I'm living my dreams. I am a successful designer, was nominated for an award, but all of this did not come just like that. So what's dialectical behavioral therapy? That is the radical acceptance of reality. The radical acceptance of reality means reality is not good or bad, it's neutral. It's just a system that you game, right? And how to be sane? It's what feminists call blame the victim. You have to blame yourself. You cannot change reality, but you can accept it and change how you react to reality. And gradually by that, you can change your life and change the world. So that was so much, basically, that made me much happier. And then I went back, and what made me happy is I realized, oh, with the parliament, what I should have changed, forgive my language, fuck feminism, but what I should have done was wore a skirt 2 inches longer. So I came from the Middle East, but I was dressed conservatively for the university, but for parliament, people dress much more conservatively than 22-year-old university students dress. And my designer skirt, which I thought was so cool, was 2 inches shorter than everyone else's skirt. So when I picked up my book, my supervisor, old enough to be my father, he thought, so bending down, he thought that I wanted to have sex with him. I did not want to have sex with a guy who looks like Porky the Pig and old enough to be my father. I can tell you that for sure. It happened long enough ago, nobody will know who that person is. So, you know, when I was like, no, I'm here to work, you know, he was really offended. So that's when I realized, okay, you know what, 70% of what you do, it's your body language. Like 70% of your communication is how you dress and how you move. So I decided that I will be a fashion designer, and I will design clothes to communicate what the woman actually wants to say, and as well as jewelry. And I'm doing really well with that and very happy. Taking responsibility is much better. Another example, briefly, is a friend of mine. She was studying here at the law school. A couple months later, there was a company party, and she got drunk. And the head of her law firm also got drunk, and then he started hitting on her. This guy was old enough to be her grandfather, and I can tell you he was probably even less attractive than the Porky the Pig guy. So, I mean, so yes, of course she was not into him, and of course, like, he was very upset, and this guy owned a law firm. He was really, really mad. She was fired that night, and he sent lots of emails everywhere. And guess what? This grandfather pillar of the community, people took his word over this young upstart who just worked at the law firm. So she actually had to change the town she worked in. You know, it's much healthier to tell girls, you know what? The best advice I got was, when you're at a company party, when the men start on their second drink, you skedaddle. Really? That's much healthier than telling all the boys everything is your fault. You know? Women should also take responsibility for themselves. That is what makes them happy. I mean, when you take responsibility for your life, that's what will make you happy. I found, as I was researching, where does this neurotic feminism come from? It's the inadvertent proselytization of the mental illness. Because when people had shell shock and other problems in the 50s, in the 60s, you didn't have Bell, let's talk, right? If you were mentally ill, people were really scared from that, and you'd be ostracized in society. So when you had an eccentric professor, somebody who's a multi-millionaire who's mentally ill, rather than accept the reality that they need to see a doctor, because that wasn't even an option then, they'd rather promote a mentally ill person who also sees the glass as half empty. And so while neurotypical feminism is culturally Christian, a lot of the early part of neurotic feminism is culturally Jewish. It's not a conspiracy. It's simply that those were the refugees who came in who had survived the Holocaust and other really horrible things. And when you survive horrible things, and especially if you're secular, you will get post-traumatic stress disorder. There's no shame in that. The only problem is leaving it untreated. They came off the boat, and then they were teaching in university. Of course, they were teaching that the glass is half empty. And from the glass half empty to half empty, and that aroused controversy. And then people like Andrea Dworkin, who's famous for Kill All Men, Gloria Steinem, Naomi Klein, they were the ones who were promoted because other people who had mental health issues were had this burning desire to promote that. And I have had PTSD, and I have recovered, so I know exactly what that feels like. When you have it, you think everyone is a sheep. You are sheeple. You must see the world in my half-empty glass way. When therapy is forcing yourself to see the glass half full, even though you don't feel like it, and to force yourself to see the glass half full so you see opportunities, so you have positive life outcomes, and gradually your life changes for the better. The final thing is, what we can do is understand that many people who have mental health issues, they have a choice. There is no shame in seeing a therapist. While what many people do is they go into their Facebook groups where they have an echo chamber for denying reality. And then they go, if you contradict them, they will go and with their friends, 50 of them attack you for 5 days and then give up. What you should do is just persevere and say, no, you need to see a therapist. There is no shame in that. So it's very good to promote dialectical behavioral therapy, to promote reason and logic, and that to say, you know, if there's a group of social activists who are behaving in a rude way, do not give in to that. Say, okay, I am sorry, you're not well. So I wish the best for you, and I want you to know that you're not alone.
Thank you, Maria. Next, we have Kriss Clément. Kriss is a feminist who has been involved in the struggle for social justice from a young age. Over her life, she has been involved in a wide variety of nonprofit groups across a wide demographic spectrum. Most recently, she has concentrated on bringing awareness to issues confronting men and boys. So, welcome, Kriss. Thank you. Okay. So, hello. I am presently the co-director of the Montreal chapter of CAFE.
And so David and the group here were kind enough to ask me to come and to explain a little bit about how I got involved in these issues. I come from a multi-ethnic and multiracial family where we were raised to be agents for social change and to be active participants in society, not simply passive citizens. We were taught to think critically, and the expressions, the only thing needed for evil to prosper is for good people to keep silent, and who paid for the buses, which is a reference to critical thinking, were common expressions in my house that I heard at least once a week, and in reality probably more often than that. From the time I was a child, I was a feminist, and instead of discouraging me, my family encouraged me, and the only barriers I had to that were my parents told me that if I was going to continue to correct all of their friends in their use of the words policemen and firemen and man with capital M, that I had to learn how to do it politely. I remember first thinking about sexism as it was directed towards men when I saw an interview during the build-up of the first Gulf War. It was an interview with a pilot who was refusing to be deployed because she was a mother. She had no sense of accountability and, in my mind, no sense of responsibility, in spite of the fact that she received millions of dollars worth of training at government and taxpayers' expense. The interview was meant to be sympathetic, and yet I was very angry and still am quite angry when I think of that incident. It really made me aware as well of the fact that it was okay in the media's eyes for her to drop out, to play the victim because she was a mother, and yet the right and the responsibility of being a father was not being recognized by the male pilots that were also in her battalion, or whatever that particular group is called. I have experienced sexism, but nothing close to stopping my goals or my sense of being able to achieve my goals. And when I did experience sexism as a woman, there was always support and acknowledgement for the fact that I was experiencing that. One story that may illustrate how serious sexism really didn't stop me from doing anything was when I was in university. Like many university students, I was struggling to pay the rent and buy food along with paying tuition, etc. And I decided, when I heard a friend talking about the Jesuits, that I would become a Jesuit. That because the Jesuits paid for higher education, and because it wasn't required to actually have faith in God, but simply to follow the doctrine, that by being a Jesuit, I would not only be able to get all of my education paid for, that I would probably be able to go far further in school than I would otherwise. I spent about 15 minutes being really happy that I had solved all my financial problems until I realized that I could not become a priest because I was a woman. I was in my 20s when this happened, so that gives you an idea of how held back I felt I was because I was a woman. Because of my family and the way they raised me, I've always been very active in the community, and the form that I've chosen to direct my energies has been in the world of the nonprofit organization, on committees, board of directors, as a volunteer coordinator. I feel very strongly that justice and injustice is not something that is seen in small pockets, but rather is something that occurs through the interaction of different systems. And so I have chosen to focus my energies on a number of different nonprofit groups. I have seen sexism directed towards men in many, many of those groups. It wasn't meant to be sexism. It was meant to be an attempt to create a fair atmosphere, and yet what happened was most definitely sexism. There were many hiring committees I was on where when one talked about affirmative action, what was meant was hiring women. When I pointed out that if you really wanted to have an affirmative action hiring policy that made sense, the fact that all the employees were presently women meant that you had to start looking at male applicants more seriously and start examining capacity building policies. After many years, one of the nonprofits that I worked with actually hired a male. He was so far qualified because he works with children. Many of the boys he works with now have a male role model that they can look up to. It was a really good move on the part of the hiring committee and the group that I worked for. I have also been on many committees where there was a discussion of having programs in place for single mothers. After a number of times pointing out that that was sexist, I stated that I would resign if they put a policy in place like that, that I was all behind supporting the rights of single parents, but single mothers was sexist and illegal. And I don't honestly think that anybody would have refused services to men in those organizations. They were really good organizations who really cared about their clientele. But I think language is important. And as a child, when I pointed out that it should be police officer, not policeman, that's part of the whole continuum that takes place when language is abused, I think. Other examples that I saw in the nonprofit world were groups where large groups like this would break up into discussion groups. It was made policy in one group to have those discussion groups being all male or all female, so that there would be safe places for women to express their opinions. There were also policies that there would be 2 mics put up for question and answer periods, and that those questions would have to alternate between male and female, not based on who would first come up to ask a question. Some of the most serious examples of sexism that I've seen, however, have been in the courts and in the family court system specifically. One of my best friends went through many years of a custody fight. It was documented by court officials that the mother was incapable of providing proper care for his daughter, in spite of the fact that there was court documentation that he was a good father who provided a warm home. And after 23 lawyers, 5 judges, and the final judge stating that she would leave the room so that my friend could work things out with the ex, he finally reached a point where he had to give up. I think what's important in this is not only my friend's loss, which is significant, but also the fact that his daughter has lost a father and access to the rest of her family through him. It's a good example, I think, of how injustice in one area can spread to others. It's one of, as I said, it's one of the reasons that I've chosen to work in a number of different domains. When I saw how little support systematically my friend got, how little support there was for him to deal with the fallout of that, the lead up, the lack of legal support, and then the fallout to that. When I saw the jobs that he has lost, and some of the comments that some of my friends have made. One of my old bosses looked at him and one day after the end of his court case and said, well, don't you think it's time for you to move on? And I remember distinctly when he looked at her and said, well, what would you do if somebody kidnapped your daughter and you didn't know how she was? She said, oh my God, I would never stop fighting. I would fight to the ends of the earth. I would, and then she stopped and she looked at him and it's like she finally got it. I've heard many comments like that. That would never have been directed at a woman. I would like to end this, and I think hopefully I'm under and I'm not over. Okay, all right. I'd like to end this by a quote that I think is really significant. It's by Martin, and I'm going to mispronounce his last name, Niemöller. In Germany, they came first for the communists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a communist. And then they came for the trade unionists, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a trade unionist. And then they came for the Jews, and I didn't speak up because I wasn't a Jew. And then they came for me. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kriss. Next, we have Janice Fiamengo. Yes. Janice is, Janice is a professor of English here at the University of Ottawa and an author of the Fiamengo Files, a series of videos on academic feminism, free speech, and campus politics. So, welcome, Janice.
Thank you. I wrote out my talk because I hope that I'm going to keep it under 10 minutes. So why I became a men's advocate. I started off life as a feminist when I was in school because I was taught the feminist stock in trade of partial truths and some outright fabrications that constitute, I think, what most of us now think we know about our society, past and present. So I learned that men objectify women. I learned that men abuse women, that they pay them less for the same work, and also that men envy women. Maybe not all men are like that, but even the good men benefit from what was called systemic male privilege. All of the good things that men had created in our culture, the great art and the buildings and the culture, the incredible medical technology that has made our lives so much better. All of that was passed over in silence generally, or even mentioned sometimes as evidence of male domination. The basic hard work of men, men's drudgery in physically incredibly demanding and even crippling jobs that most women can't and don't want to do, even now. I don't think I ever heard a feminist thought leader mention that work as a reason to thank men and care for them. I don't think I ever heard a feminist thought leader acknowledge that women owe men gratitude for the inventions that men came up with and shared with women, some of which enabled women to be liberated from their domestic chores in order to make their way into the classrooms and into the voting booths and into the lecture halls and into the business offices and the halls of legislature, etc., from where many women have spent the last 50 years telling men how lousy they are. As a woman who received a lot of kindness and decency from the men in my life, my university professors I remember so fondly, my bosses, one of them is here tonight, my coworkers and friends, and especially my father and my husband, I admire men. And I'm really glad to have men and male energy, male ways of being, a male sense of humor. I'm delighted to have that in the world. I don't want it to be diminished. I'm surprised that more women don't feel that way strongly, or at least don't speak up on that issue. And every day, I think that our culture demonstrates a shocking callousness in failing to acknowledge men's humanity. Men have always suffered and sacrificed, and they are certainly suffering now. I want to talk a little bit about male privilege, so-called, and what it looks like in our society. I'm drawing from a wonderful essay by Grant Brown called Country C, some of this. The basic facts. Most violence committed by men is directed at men themselves, while most of women's violence is also directed at men. Overall, men are twice as likely to be victims of violence and 3 times as likely to be murdered as women are, yet government commissions are set up to look into the problem of violence against women and not into the much larger problem of violence against men. Men's treatment by the criminal justice system is shockingly inequitable. Men are far more likely than women to be investigated, charged, and convicted for similar crimes on similar evidence. Women are far more likely to be believed innocent, given favorable plea deals, and awarded probation, even when participating together in the same crime with men. In violent conflicts between men and women, it is standard police procedure to take the men to jail even before it has been established who was at fault or who was the aggressor. Perhaps most alarmingly of all, Canadian law recognizes several excuses for women to kill men with impunity. And there's no parallel recognizing men's right to kill women. In a large number of cases, women who kill men serve no time at all in prison. Men account for 75 to 85% of all the homeless adults in our country, yet public money is spent on subsidized housing and shelters for needy women, much of it to the exclusion of equally needy men. The school system favors the distinctive needs and interests of girls. Few men are credentialed to teach at the primary level, so boys lack positive role models. Girls tend to get better grades than boys at every level, and boys have higher failure and dropout rates than girls, all the way from primary school right up to the university level. Yet, millions of dollars of public money is spent on scholarships and other inducements aimed exclusively at increasing the participation rate of girls, or young women, at university, even though the participation rate of young women is already significantly higher than that of young men. As a result of young women's much greater level of participation in higher education, young men are falling behind in the job market as well. Yet, women continue to enjoy legislated employment preferences. Manual labor and high-risk jobs remain, of course, the preserve of men. Approximately 95% of workplace deaths occur to men. One could go on and on. When these discussion of these statistics takes place in the media, feminists who dominate media discussions usually account for facts like these by maintaining that patriarchy hurts men too, and that feminist reform of men's toxic masculinity holds the key to future improvement. Men who complain about the inequalities of our society are brought forward as proof of the sniveling, inferior nature of men and of how much more needs to be done to stamp out sexism and promote women. The anti-hate-mongering legislation in our country has nothing to say about hate directed against men as a class, and in fact, it seems to me that our government itself countenances and promotes such hatred. I stopped being a feminist when I started teaching at university and saw that the young men in my classes, far from being privileged, were captive victims to a university-wide propaganda machine telling them that they were no good. I stopped being a feminist when I saw the injustice of equity hiring programs that passed over well-qualified men in favor of lesser qualified women in the name of justice. And I just got tired of the non-stop celebration of all things feminine and the non-stop demonization of all things of all things masculine. It seems to me that the silence of our leaders on the subject of male goodness and male suffering will one day, I hope, be recognized as the massive human rights violation that I think it is. And until that day, I will keep on saying my piece. Thank you.
Thank Thank you, Janice. Next, we have Meg Warren. Meg is a mother of 2 and a local cafe volunteer. While she's particularly empathetic to survivors of domestic violence, something she herself has experienced, she's also passionate about a wide range of issues facing both men and women. Welcome, Meg.
Thank you. It's actually really difficult to get up here and talk after all of these women have said their piece, because I come at this from a very informal perspective. I have not studied gender issues. I am not a psychologist, and I feel, that I'm really coming from a very anecdotal place. So I'm not the authority on anything, but I'm just, I have particular experiences that have led me to this place, and I just wanted to share those with everybody, I guess. I don't label myself a men's rights activist. The reason for that is I really struggle with labels altogether. I think everybody has their own association with each term. I also don't like really the word rights as in a gendered issue. I don't think that women have rights and men have rights. I think humans have rights. We all have rights. And, each gender will experience, their world in a different way that's unique to their gender, but everybody's rights should be the same. So that's why I don't call myself a men's rights activist. I also am struggling right now with the label feminist, because I've used it before, but I find that sometimes it's grossly oversimplified, especially when people say things like, I saw a t-shirt recently that said, feminism is the bizarre notion that women are people. And I think that when you say something like that, nobody would really in their right mind stand up and say, well, I don't believe that women are people, so therefore I must be a feminist. And if you question feminism or aspects of feminism, then, it's like, well, I'm afraid to say that, because then that must mean that I don't think, women are people, and people make all kinds of assumptions about it. So I struggle with where I fit in right now with a label. But the beginning of my journey into sort of realizing that men's issues were legitimate started when I separated with the father of my children. There was some really interesting things that happened during that time. I have a son and a daughter, and when I knew that I wasn't going to be living with their dad, and that we had to figure out what we were doing with custody, we went to a mediator to help us figure out, what we were going to do. And we immediately, when the mediator asked us, what's your custody arrangement, we both looked at each other and we said 50-50. And the mediator was shocked. And she looked at me and she said, "Are you sure?" And it struck me as odd, because, he's their dad. He's 50% responsible for them being there. And it felt very strange to me that the automatic assumption would be that they would stay with me. And don't get me wrong, it was a very difficult decision, because I had to then give up half of my time with them. But it was a little bit bizarre to me that it would be, that I would try to do that just for me. It was really about them and about him as well. I started looking for resources as a single mom, because I didn't really understand the experience of growing up as a boy. So I started reading books like The Purpose of Boys by Michael Gurian, and Boys Adrift by Dr. Leonard Sachs. And I started really hearing about the importance of boys having strong male role models. And I really started opening up to just basically the importance of that kind of thing. Their father was constantly paranoid that I was going to do something to steal them away from him. And I couldn't figure out where that paranoia was coming from. But the more I paid attention to him and to what was going on around me, the more I realized that that was a really strong concern for everybody. Are we good? For men specifically, and I was curious about why that was. A lot of women had the same reaction as the mediator, how could you do that? How could you give up 50% of your time with your kids? How come you didn't fight for that? And it really was too weird for me. Then I entered the dating world, and I don't know if anybody has any experience with online dating, but it's quite different for men. Quite different for men than it is for women. And when I started going on dates, I would often pay on the first date. And just watching how surprised men were about that struck me as really strange, because I thought, you know, this is a feminist world where women are equal. Why are we not at least sharing, if not sometimes paying? The assumption is always that the man will pay. And I started really listening to the men and their stories about their dating experiences. And when I really listened, the things that they told me were particularly strikingly, I don't know how to say that without going into detail about it, but it was almost as if they were rambling off credentials at a job interview. I'm very feminist, you know, and I believe in women's rights, and they were so adamant about wanting to prove that. But I was really more curious about hearing what they were dealing with and what they were going through. I have a son in school, and he struggles right now because he's a very active child, and they're starting to take away a lot of the activities that kids can do now. There's sports on the playground is being limited. He has a lot of energy to burn. He has a hard time sitting through a class and just, you know, listening to a presentation from the teacher. And he needs that rough and tumble play and that break from just sitting still all the time. And I'm constantly afraid that everybody's going to tell me that he has ADD, because he doesn't. He really doesn't. I mean, we've already talked to a doctor about it. But I feel like he's being pushed into that. It's like, why can't he sit still? Why can't he conform? Why can't he do this? And I've never had the same issues with my daughter. You know, I mean, it's just a totally different experience for each of them. When I started becoming vocal about my concerns and about what I was seeing and my observations, the reactions I had from my peers and some of my family was really interesting. They were very defensive about feminism. They tried to deny some of the things that were happening. There was a lot of resistance, and I found that resistance really suspicious, and it made me want to do more digging. I really wanted to bring awareness to certain issues, but I felt like I couldn't talk about it. Immediately, I started losing friends. People didn't want to talk about it with me. They didn't even want to engage. And so I thought that I was doing something wrong. I'll tell you a little bit about my experience with domestic abuse. I don't really want to go into detail about what exactly happened to me, but one thing in particular that I'm interested in as a men's issue is how men experience domestic abuse. And whenever I talk about providing services for men, like shelters for men and that kind of thing, and support after they're leaving an abusive relationship, a lot of the response is, yeah, but women have it worse. A lot more women end up in the hospital. A lot more women are faced with being killed. And I take particular issue with that because of the experience that I had. It was the psychological abuse that was the most disturbing for me. That was the stuff that 13 years later still haunts me. And I feel like, you know, what you see in the mainstream world with regards to abuse is if there's not a bruise and broken bones and blood and all that stuff, then somehow, you know, it's not that bad. But I was never told that. When I went to get help, nobody said, oh, well, you're not in the hospital, or you know, there's other women who have it worse than you. I was given the support that I needed, certainly when I first left the relationship. So when I talk about, you know, men experiencing domestic abuse, why would someone say, oh, but women have it worse? When you compare men and women side by side like that, I think it's very telling. That reaction is very telling about, you know, our empathy towards men. And that in itself made me really start digging, and I wanted to get involved and say, okay, something's going on. And I think that is worth exploring. So that's why I joined CAFE. And, you know, some of the stuff that I hear as I go online and I research and I listen to other people, some of it's shocking, and you have to take it one step at a time, and some of it I don't fully absorb yet. Maybe I will, maybe I won't. but some of it, you know, as you take it slowly, you kind of start to open up your mind and you start to see things that you didn't necessarily see before. So I'm still exploring that, and again, like I said, I'm not necessarily an expert in any particular field, but you don't need to be. And I wondered, you know, if I should even be on this panel at first, because I knew I would be with people who had a lot of research and information that was really sort of official, and mine's just anecdotal. But it's really important. Anybody can get involved, anybody can be passionate about something and lend a hand, and you don't have to adopt that label. So if you're afraid of somebody saying, you know, oh, like they're gonna label you a men's rights activist, or you're just gonna be a woman hater or whatever, you can get involved and just be involved for the passion and for the empathy, and that's enough, and it helps a lot. So that's all.
Well, I just want to say thank you to the ladies who shared tonight. One more round of applause. It takes a lot to come up. I believe we're going to open to questions from the audience. If you would have a question, your hand up, I'll point you out, and David will bring the microphone to you. So anyone have any follow-up or anything they'd like to add?
Thanks. My question is for Janice, who undoubtedly has run into Dr. Brown from Toronto with regards to his story with primary schools and secondary schools. It's the whole thing about the male role model in the school that seems to be missing more and more. I'd like you to comment on the fact that it's very difficult for males to become teachers today, if only to make a career in it, given the risks involved.
Yes, well, that's the problem. There's a crying need for men, and yet I've read numerous accounts by men, some of whom have had to leave teaching because they were falsely accused of, sorry, I don't know if you heard that, but I have a pretty loud voice usually. So yeah, it's not an environment that it's not safe for men. So, but surely there are ways that we could make it safer by changing the cultural climate. Because men in those positions are desperately needed. But yeah, right now, I don't know that I would actually feel very good about recommending to men that they consider primary school teaching as their career. Because it's too dangerous. Many work environments are becoming very dangerous for men. You're one false accusation away from having your life ruined and certainly your career ended. So yeah, it's a problem.
I do have another question. This one for Meg. So you spoke about your experience with your son in school. Mm-hmm. I've heard the same things, well, with regards to my nephews in particular. Now, the solution of choice, it seems to me, is for the boys to take Ritalin to take care of the ADD and whatnot. And I'm just wondering to what extent, if you've had that experience, and of course, if any of the other panelists have an experience in that, I'd like them to comment on that, please.
What is specifically the question? Would I give? They haven't forced him. I might be.
Okay, did the discussion come up? I suppose is where I'm getting at in your case.
No, so to be fair, this year in particular, I spoke to his teacher, and I really asked the question, how is he compared to the other boys? You know, not just, because I know that the teachers are overwhelmed, and I know that they've got lots of students in the class, and I just said, if you really pay attention to the boys versus the girls, this is part of the reading that I did by Dr. Leonard Sachs, talks about, you know, the difference between boys and girls in learning environments specifically, and, you know, it says that boys tend to be more tactile and more hands-on and visual learners and kinetic learners and that kind of thing. So I just, you know, I know that they're set up in a classroom where everybody's sitting and watching the teacher. And when I said to her, if you compare the girls, are they sitting still for you versus the boys? How does he compare to the rest of the boys? And she admitted, she said, well, it's the boys that are an issue. And so I said, is it possible, do you think maybe that this is actually completely normal? And I think she kind of understood where I was going with that. So they haven't pushed. We haven't had a push on the school's end. And it probably is a little bit of my worry and paranoia that it might come to that, because I know that that's not what's happening to him. And I know that that's not a problem for him, that he doesn't have ADD. But I'm just worried that everybody wants him to, because it'll be easier for the teacher. So if you give him medication, then he'll sit still and you know. So no, there hasn't been a push in that direction.
No, I'll just project. Sorry, I might be a little loud with this. I had a question for each one of you, each person. I'll just do one at a time, though. Well, we're on this one with Meg. Yeah, I'm concerned about, you mentioned your boy in school, and that the teacher said, yeah, it's a problem. The boys are a problem. Seeing that I've worked with children for many years, I'm just curious, if they're not pushing the drugs yet for him, have they talked about methodology? Because I had just interviewed 3 young men on a bus maybe about 4 months ago, and they were talking about how in their school, he was about to hit the story behind this interview with the kid, but he's beating on his mother just as a game, and it's funny. He's rolling up his little fist and saying, "You're lucky you're a girl, because I'd hit you if you weren't." And I said, well, that's a very interesting point, you know? So you'd hit a boy, but you won't hit a girl. He said, yeah, but the teachers at our school say that the girls we're told not to hit girls, but they are allowed to hit us. And this is a 7-year-old and his 8-year-old friend talking about how the teachers at school are encouraging the violent behavior of girls upon the boys, but the boys have to basically make a promise not to hit the girls. And that's at a primary school level. So I'm going to ask you to answer the question, or will you ask your son if this has ever come up, if you haven't yet? And just to add a question to Janice on this.
Wait, let me answer, because I'm going to forget.
Okay.
Otherwise.
Sorry.
I'm going to forget what I wanted to say.
All right.
So I have to be really careful, because a lot of the information that I'm getting is coming from a 9-year-old and a 5-year-old. I do get some information from the teacher, but it's mostly prompted from what I hear from the kids, and then I go looking for more. So what I'm hearing is that there's a lot of consensual rough and tumble play between my son and his other male friends. And it's, you know, it's rough, and they sometimes get a little bit hurt, but nobody's ended up in the hospital. But the teachers really don't like that happening. And I understand, you know, there's liability and, you know, but to a certain extent, they need to do that. I fell down as a kid, I scraped my knee, and I want both of my kids to do that. And that's how you learn your limitations and your boundaries. So he gets in trouble for that kind of thing, and that's usually when I get a letter home, sort of like, you know, wasn't listening when we said stop with that. My daughter, on the other hand, you know, she grew up with an older brother, so she can be quite rough herself. And sometimes she comes home with all of these bruises, and I'm like, where did that happen? And she says, oh, so-and-so and we were jumping on each other's backs, and we were doing this. I'm not getting any letters home from her. I'm not hearing anything. And when I ask them both about it, you know, like my son will say, oh yeah, I saw that happening, and this is what they were doing, and she'll fully admit that it was happening. So why am I hearing from it? Is it because they're older? I don't know. I mean, I just don't. They're both engaging in the same activity, but I'm only hearing that it's a problem from one. So it makes me, again, like a lot of this stuff is just, it kind of makes me suspicious. And I haven't made any definitive decisions yet about what it means, but I see enough of it that all these little things add up, and it makes me go, what's going on?
Okay, thank you. Thank you. The second part of this question was going to Janice, in the sense that once you get up to a university level, because I think I saw this, I'm sure I saw this in one of your Fiamengo files, that about the indoctrination of university level boys, about how they have male privilege, about how it reminded me of the movie Jesus Camp, how they were so indoctrinated to say, no, you have privilege, and anything that you say that opposes that, you could actually fail my class because you're in a gender class, so you have to admit that you have male privilege, and if you don't, then you're going to be punished for it. And that, just watching it, it kind of puts me in a place that, yeah, so if you disagree, you're going to be punished. And so it feels as though they're so indoctrinated with this idea at a university level that you have to fall in with what I see as like I said, the Jesus camp behavior, a cult-like behavior. Either you get on board or you're out. You're ostracized from the whole university community.
Yeah, well, we do imagine that we're a secular culture, but in fact, you know, the clear scapegoating, the positing of male evil, you know, and female redemptive capacity, it's really just a kind of secular application of the worst of any kind of evangelical faith without the infinitely merciful loving God. There is no infinitely merciful loving God in the SJW ideology, but there certainly is original sin, and it's men's original sin. Yeah, I mean, it can't be exaggerated. Anyone who doesn't know the environment might think, she's just, you know, she's blowing a few things out of proportion. I don't think it can be exaggerated. I've given talks where men stood up like puppets and said, I'm white, I'm male, I'm able-bodied, I'm heterosexual, so I'm just checking my privilege, you know, and they had to do that mantra before they could even proffer whatever feminist compliant point they were about to make. And obviously they'd been very carefully trained that that was necessary for them. And yeah, ever since Peggy McIntosh, who was a sociologist and women's studies professor in the late 1980s, published the Invisible Knapsack, which was all about how whites and males have this whole bundle of supposed invisible privileges that they had to acknowledge. They had to do the morally necessary work of examining the way in which they had these, what she called, unearned assets. In other words, they had all these things that other people didn't have. And they should, you know, in a just world, they should be taken away from them. It was just a big long list that she made up of mostly subjective things, many of them totally unverifiable. And of course, the really convenient thing about the charge of privilege, which is about the worst thing you can say about anybody now, it means that you're not qualified to speak about things and that you have things you shouldn't have. But the really convenient thing about that notion of privilege is that it's invisible. So it's a perfect trap. You either recognize your privilege and admit that you are guilty, and if you don't recognize it and say, I deny it, I don't see that I'm privileged, then you're doubly guilty, because not only do you have it, but you don't even recognize that you have it. So you're blind and arrogant at the same time. And speaking of privilege, there was a talk that Karen Strawn gave a couple years ago where one of the fathers in the audience stood up and said, speaking of childhood, playground and that sort of thing, a girl had come up to his son, I think they were both about 7 or 8, and she gave him a big wallop. I don't know if it was in his chest or the face or something, but it was a pretty violent punch. And she said, I can punch you and you can't punch me back. And so she, you know, she'd figured it out, and who can blame her? And that was her privilege.
Yeah, I have a daughter.
They're smart.
I have actually a good response about this. Yeah, I grew up in the Middle East, so there wasn't really discussion of gender, just like people raised kids and stuff, and yeah, there was, you know, there's like the media, there's lying that, you know, it's the reverse, but it's like women are taught the point of men having, you know, that it's not the reverse of feminism, it's just like we just grow up and live our normal life. What really shocked me here, moving to the West, was Facebook. So Facebook, yes. So I had another immigrant friend. She found this video of this girl, Lauren Southern, I think her name was, and she was saying how she was not a feminist. So my friend who's in Nigeria was like, this is really interesting. And at that time, my friend called herself a bad feminist, and so did I. And it was just like, oh. So I watched the video. I was like, this is interesting. And then I threw it on my Facebook wall. I was like, oh, she has very interesting points. I didn't know what quite to make of this. Oh my God. My startup co-founder, a woman in San Francisco, who, like, when my husband proposed to me, she was there. Oh, she cut off all contact and pretended I was dead. I was like, what the hell? This is like an in-person friend. Another friend was like, Lauren Southern. We still don't talk until this day. So we're really close. And then she was like, I can't believe you have this video. And I'm like, I don't know what's wrong having a video on a Facebook wall. Copy link, paste link. Is this a crime? Did I kill anyone? You know? And then it's like, no, but she's questioning feminism. I am like, okay, we should question everything. Why can't we question feminism? Why can't we question everything but that? Well, I was like, no, but you can't. I'm like, you know, I'm half Russian, right? And we grew up through communism. And what would happen under Brezhnev was simply that, but I grew up in Yemen, and with Brezhnev, that my mom grew up under, there were no more gulags. You'd simply lose your job, right? You'd simply get social ostracism if you don't follow the party. And my friend was Ukrainian, Canadian, and she was like, oh, like, you know, we are all feminists. And I'm like, no, like, this is like communism. This is passive-aggressive totalitarianism. How can we stand for this? This was part of what I said was like, this is insanity. You know, this is really not only proselytizing mental illness by accident, but this proselytization of mental illness and people just not accepting that stuff is not healthy. It was just passive-aggressive totalitarianism. And back to sexism is, you know, ISIS, we don't like ISIS, right? Because they're aggressive in a male-aggressive way. Another thing about abuse of women, because it's in a male-aggressive, easy to see the bruises, okay, they get shelter, they get help. But how about female aggression? How about this passive-aggressive totalitarianism? And I lost quite a few friends by saying, I am sorry, but this makes no sense to me. This is dictatorship. You know, we have a whole Arab Spring where people are dying for freedom and democracy around the world, and you here support passive-aggressive totalitarianism. But more and more people are beginning to see how the SJWs are crazy and staying away from that. But, you know, you're absolutely valid in your concerns with this.
Sorry?
Oh,
I
is there
had my hand up.
follow-up?
Yes, I'd like to have a question
follow-up?
myself. So it seems to me that a fundamental issue here is a difference in empathy, that we have greater empathy for women than we do for men.
Absolutely.
And so do any of you want to speak about why you think that is? Where does this empathy come from? How come some women empathize with men and some women don't? Any ideas?
Can I say something? Okay. I keep thinking about when I was a little girl, I used to play with dolls because that's what I wanted to do. And one day I told my mother that there was something really wrong because all my dolls were girls. What happened to the little boys? All I was doing was caring and giving love to little girls, and anatomically incorrect little girls at that. My mother managed to go out and get an anatomically correct baby boy doll for me to care for. That keeps going around in my head because I keep thinking, are we training our children that little girls need more care, that little girls are somehow more valuable and more delicate? The other thing is, I think some of us are not taught to think critically or rewarded to think critically, and some of us are still taught to think of people in groups of categories, men and women, black and white, Jewish and Gentile, instead of looking at people. And while categories are useful to a certain degree, I think you need to be able to think critically to deconstruct all of that.
There's a guy back here who's had his hand. Oh, sorry.
Did you
I just wanted to say, in addition to that, I mean, that's such an interesting question. Lots of friends of mine in the men's rights movement think that empathy for women is just programmed right into us as, you know, human beings. I know you know all of this too, that it's necessary for cultures to survive, to protect women. Men are expendable. So, you know, whether we're ever going to be able to get ourselves out of that is a big question. But I agree that, you know, the way we're taught to think has a great deal to do with it too. And there's a wonderful essay by a man named Glenn Poole called The Empathy Gap, and he really recommend it. He talks about how it's right in the language, speaking of that, Kriss, that, you know, in the way news stories are reported. If a bunch of men are killed in a battle or whatever it happens to be, it's called persons killed, whereas if women and children are harmed, then they're identified as women or girls being harmed. When boys and men are harmed, it's not news, it's just people killed. And he does a really great job of looking at the way that that's just part of how we understand conflict and social issues. And I was reading an article just recently about, it's a report on suicide, I guess it's called suicidality, suicidal thoughts in young people. And it was a very recent report in 2016, Canadian teens reporting on their suicidal thoughts. And the report it talked about teens generally, but twice it specified the sex. It said that girls were 2 times more likely to have a plan for how they would kill themselves. So this is very serious. And girls were also 2 times more likely to have body image issues, which is one of the drivers of suicidal thoughts. And so reading this article, you would think that girls committed suicide much more frequently than boys. It made no mention of boys, but of course anybody who's done any research on the subject knows that boys commit suicide far more frequently than girls. In fact, men commit suicide in general at a rate of 3 to 4 times the rate of women. And so obviously, well, it seems obvious to me anyway, that the reason that girls were talking about their suicidal thoughts and their plans was that that's what girls do. They talk about them and then they don't kill themselves, whereas boys were killing themselves without talking about it, and the report never mentioned it. The lack of empathy was astounding.
Boys are also the highest growing demographic of people with anorexia and body image issues now too, and that's never talked about.
I think it's to do with changing our society, and naturally, sadly, the facts are, if we accept reality, that wombs are more valuable in the population in a war. I mean, if a man is killed, well, you know, in my grandfather's generation, only 2% of men survived. But the fact that the women survived, these 2% of men managed to cover quite a few wombs in between them, and the population revived. But if you kill off the women, then in a war, it's hard for the population to replenish. This is our biology and instinct. And so having patriarchy and patriarchal religions, you balance the female privilege, because really female privilege is a thing, and it's a result of being born with a womb, and it's a result of the population replenishing itself in a war. So having a patriarchy balances female privilege by honoring the fact that more men will have to die for society to repopulate itself in a war. So it's a yin and yang and a balance. So our modern society of equality, we have to realize our bodies are not equal.
Can I actually just add something to, Janice made a good point about how, you know, men don't typically talk about stuff, you know, the way girls do. And we tend to empathize more with things that we can relate to. And I know for me, you know, when I started thinking about my own experience with domestic abuse, when I think of a man in that position, I think, you know, he's just as deserving as I am. But if men aren't talking about their issues, then, you know, we have a hard time knowing that they're out there to empathize with. At the same time, we don't let them talk about their issues. And so you're really stuck. And I can't even talk about, I mean, I can here, but like I think about my experience on Facebook, like I mentioned, anytime I posted anything that brought awareness to men's issues, it was like, no, the focus is on women here. But how are you supposed to know that these things are happening if we can't talk about them? But in order to empathize with them, we need to know that we can relate to them. Like, it's just such a big mess.
Because I'm from Montreal, frequently in December, the Polytechnic anniversary is a huge, huge deal there. And every year I get into arguments with my friends about the fact that none of the male victims are ever discussed. It's all about the female victims. No one realizes that, I can't remember, I think it's at least 2, maybe 3 of the male victims went on to commit suicide. They got no support. They were blamed for not standing up for the female victims. The reality is I never heard a single female victim blamed for not standing up to the guns. I think we really need to change how we talk about things and how we view society. And one of the things I really love about CAFE is that we can openly disagree with each other and yet still move towards a common goal. I'm not personally a big fan of sociobiology. I think we are so lucky to live in this country, so we can move beyond that. We can help teach our children and help fight against whatever instincts we may or may not have. And I really think we need to encourage everyone to talk. We need to encourage everyone to be better citizens. We need to think critically. And I don't think that we need to value lives more deeply if they're male or if they're female. And I've completely gone on a brain freeze, so I'm going to stop now. I'm sorry, I was heading someplace, but I've forgotten.
Okay, I will interrupt as a social justice feminist and say something.
Can we move on to questions
Sorry?
from the
We
floor?
got one more question there. Actually, I just wanted to follow up with David's comment. He used the term lack of empathy. When I think about this thing, I don't think about lack of empathy. To me, it's dehumanization, and it's active. And it's fairly long-standing. I mean, the patriarchs of the last generation laughed about cannon fodder, right? Telling 10 million men blown up in the trenches of World War I. But the women's movement more actively dehumanizes men. Men are not allowed to have problems. The fact that they are depressed and killing themselves is denied. And I don't think that's a horrible accident. I think that's deliberate. Because the whole raison d'etre of feminism is to blame men for everything. And if men are allowed to have problems, then things get a little complicated. The Duluth, you guys are familiar with the Duluth model? The wheel of power and control? Well, that becomes a lot less believable if people stop and ask themselves, well, was that abusive man maybe an abused child? Right? As soon as you start humanizing the male experiences, a lot of the rhetoric and the ideology and the belief systems of women become pretty obviously delusional. So I never talk about lack of empathy. When people say something that dehumanizes men, I say, you just dehumanized men, and here's how you did it. And I go back to some old-fashioned ethics created by a lot of men that I really respect, and I dredge it up. I use old-fashioned language that people aren't used to getting rid of. And I don't know, I've still lost friends, but I've also convinced some people, and I've also had success at school. Schools dehumanize boys, and that's a little hard to justify. So if I was at a school and I heard a teacher saying, it's okay for a girl to hit a boy, I'd be in there the next day. My daughter has been trained to rat these teachers out. She'll come home and tell me stuff, and then I will take it to the school. And it's not personal then. And I will make sure that the teacher is spoken to. I'll make sure that at least that stops in the classroom. But my daughter will do that because I've taught her not to dehumanize men. She's got 2 big brothers, right? And they're supposed to treat her with respect. She has to treat them with respect. anyway, that's the language that I use, and I find it helps because it's not language, everyone's familiar with empathy. And it's hard to convince people that a little lack of empathy is really a bad thing. But dehumanization is a well-known form of human degradation. It's a war technique, and there's a war being fought. So I think you should use the appropriate language.
Is there anyone else out there? Questions? Comments? Oh.
I'd just like to comment on when people talk about ADD. Now, I'm a teacher. I'm a high school teacher. I first stepped into a high school in 1980 as a teacher. So I have a little bit of experience. And this ADD nonsense, as far as I'm concerned, is it's basically a fabricated disease. And the way I see it, it's called being a boy. It's called being an athletic, active boy. So if any teacher tells you that maybe you should have your child diagnosed or go see a psychologist, see if they have ADD, I would really not pay attention to anything they're saying. They're just doing it there for their convenience because they can't control the kid. And what's needed for a lot of these boys, like I had a class and it was almost a gender-specific class. It was mainly boys and it was a non-academic class. And basically what I did with them was lots of competition. And you know, if you're really restless at the beginning of the class, we go outside and we do push-ups or we do some races or something like that. And it works like magic. But you see, you don't get that in the school system now because you've got, what you have is you've got a lot of teachers looking at everything, as I say it, through a feminist prism. And it's a very anti-male thing. No competition, no one's better than anyone else, sit there and don't be a boy. And I feel, you know, that this kind of thing just gets perpetuated. And what's also happened, as I say, over 36 years, what I've noticed is that you've got more and more women in the system, and most of them are of a feminist nature, and a lot of the men, too, are like that. They'll go along with all this stuff. For instance, in my school, we give out awards for the highest marks in classes, and in grades 9 to 11, there's 9 math courses. And out of those 9 math courses, only one boy had the highest mark. Now, if you know anything about giftedness, girls in verbal expression, it's usually that girls are identified twice as much as boys in verbal expression for giftedness. But in math and science, it's the reverse. It's usually twice as many boys as girls that are determined to be giftedness. So in my school, we had 9 classes and only one boy had the highest mark. I was wondering what's going on. Like, why are these boys underachieving? So I set up a committee that I wanted to, you know, bring awareness to the underachievement of males. But the way I was treated after this, the way that I was castigated, people objected to it. You know, this doesn't happen very often. Oh, yes, it does. You know, and I started the committee, and I was roadblocked every which way I turned, just because it was boys underachieving. And eventually, I had to be investigated because I was causing trauma to my peers.
Oh my God.
So this is the kind of thing that goes on in the school, and I'm not blaming the women, but the men are like this too. They go along with it. In fact, I think I related this to Janice earlier. In my school, I was just talking to someone about the wage gap, and I'm a mathematician. I teach math, and I was just using logic. If women get paid 77 cents on the dollar compared to men, why would you hire men? Well, their reaction was, I'm going straight to the union with that comment. See, this is the kind of thing you have to deal with. You can't, it's very hard to do anything for boys in the school system. And no one dares speak up. I spoke up. Look, if you know what happened to me, I got transferred out of the school.
Do you want to come and work at my son's school?
I would love to.
Because I'll tell you something, the one class that he is doing really, really well in has a male teacher. And he's excelling in that, and he loves that subject.
Yeah.
And the rest of them, he's not doing so well.
Yeah, well, I've heard that. Like, there's some great female teachers, don't get me wrong, but you need more male teachers. You need more male teachers that are really male teachers.
Or just a variety, yeah.
Yeah, well, you get a lot of these guys that are just so pro-female. They've bought into the feminist indoctrination. I don't know if they believe it all, but they just do it so that they can get along with everybody. But boys are suffering. I was removed out of my school, and I've known at least 5 boys now that have dropped out of math because they were expecting to have me as a teacher. And I coached the hockey team. The hockey team would have won the championship probably this year, but they didn't do very well. So, but see, they don't really care about the boys. They don't really care. They just want to shut up someone that is going against the orthodoxy, the modern, the cultural Marxist orthodoxy.
That's exactly true. And who else is affected is girls, in a way, who have things like Asperger's. Was diagnosed with mild Asperger's later in life. It's highly mild. Einstein apparently also, they thought ADD, but you have really with females who have Asperger's, you have masculine traits. And we don't see women as a role model. I couldn't understand a thing my mom was doing or why. My mom loved shopping. I thought that was absolutely nuts. Then after the pageant, I actually started working in retail. I realized, okay, yes, women have their own craziness, but I'll game it and make money. But really, you also have females who need male role models because of whatever condition they have as well. So this cultural Marxism actually hurts a lot of women who need a male role model too, because we just cannot understand, until pageants, until lots of things, we just cannot understand or relate to other women. It takes work, so.
The other thing that I just wanted to quickly add is, if you accept the fact that women need far more female role models than we have traditionally had in order to excel, then you have to accept the fact that boys need male role models. You can't have one and not the other. It comes back to fairness and critical thinking.
So I'm a law student at the university here. I've just come here from India to complete my master's in international law. And for the first 3 months, I've been sitting here thinking I was stuck in some strange Twilight Zone episode that I wasn't in on. Because my areas of discipline revolve around public international law, international trade law, the Geneva Convention, laws of war. And for some reason, for the first 3 months, I was told that the solution for all of this was eradicating the patriarchal system. And I was very confused at first because I thought I was left out of the circle. Like the example I gave earlier was, they said that the International Court of Justice was unfair because it comprised of old white men. And I've never understood that because I've always looked at diversity of thought in a judicial system or jurisprudence as the most valuable aspect towards a functioning system. And I see this narrative exist in a variety of circumstances where, for one, the agenda is pushed forth, and the second thing I see is that as somebody who isn't a white man, I find it confusing that certain individuals belonging to that race are not permitted to engage in discourse and debate and defend themselves to a certain extent. So my biggest question is to Professor Fiamengo is that, why is that the academic system is pushing forth this narrative? Why does it, because it's undeniable that I see across North America, not just in Canada, but in America as well, that this social justice warrior culture and narrative seeps into the academic system, and I'm in all favor for free speech. Anyone's allowed to voice their opinion. But I see the fact that opinions on even a conservative basis, on, say, I'm a constitutional conservative on a lot of things, and I'm demonized by people who refuse to understand my discipline. They seem to think I'm a racist against myself, and I've often, I sometimes sit there and go, maybe I'm not in on the game. But I just want to know, why does North America, on a contemporary day, advocate this perspective, and why isn't that free speech is protected for the opposing view as well?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I mean, that's the question. Alan Bloom wrote a book called The Closing of the American Mind in 1989, and he talked about his experience at Cornell, if I'm remembering correctly, in the late 1960s, when the Black Panthers came onto campus with guns and insisted that the entire curriculum be changed to make it reflect social justice. And he talks about how administrators caved in so quickly. And so that's his thesis, that social justice became the good of the university, and it became more important than the pursuit of truth. And I think that we are now in the 4th decade of that, the takeover of the university by social justice. For a long time, I thought maybe it was going to be confined mainly to the social sciences and the humanities, that certain other disciplines would be exempt, but it's looking more and more like even the hard sciences are now being taken over as well. And it's hard to argue against. I think that, you know, truth is just not as sexy as bringing, you know, justice to the oppressed, and that's what happens. And everything has been sacrificed to that, even excellence and the merit principle and disinterested research and all of that.
As an academician, even myself, I see that the biggest issue I have in engaging in discourse and debate with them is that they always bring up a moral argument when I bring up facts.
Mm-hmm.
And
Yeah.
in my mind, it makes no sense. But how exact, and this is a general question to everyone on the panel, is how do you combat this narrative that they propose? Because morality, in my opinion, always wins because people just want to feel good at the end of the day and don't want to admit the truth. But if you bring a factual argument up, is it actually worthwhile to engage in that debate, or is it just, you should just leave it be?
Yeah, well, I mean, I agree with you. That's it. When the moral argument is introduced, most of us, we feel embarrassed and flail around. Nobody wants to be accused of actually, you know, supporting fascism or white supremacy or whatever it happens to be. And that's the leftist position, always the ad hominem. If you're taking that position, you must support slavery. You must be a white supremacist. You must be part of the alt-right. You must hate women. And how do you argue? You know, you can't argue, I'm not, because you can't prove that. So it's impossible. Somebody's called it Kafka trapping, I think, that it's a Kafkaesque kind of argument. There's no way you can win. You either admit you are what they say you are, or you deny it, but denying it doesn't help you. So I don't know, you just have to say, I don't care about that. That's irrelevant. Okay, yeah, I'm a racist, but let's have the argument on the facts or whatever, you know, if you can. But it's pretty difficult to do so when I think deep down we want to be good people and we want people to believe that we're good people. So we're stopped from making the arguments even before we can begin. You just have to get a critical mass of people who are willing to push past the nonsense of that kind of argument, but it's very difficult to do.
Actually, I think feminists are racist. There's a part of, if you read some of their ideology, they've now come to the conclusion that discrimination against women is more harmful than discrimination, than racism. So sexism is worse than racism. But when you see how it adds up, it adds up to white female supremacists. So that would be my first argument, is I think feminists are really white female supremacists. So who are you to call anyone else a racist?
I feel like I have to say the thing that I find myself saying frequently, which is that as a feminist, I would like to point out that there are many forms of feminism, many different kinds of feminists, and I think if you really want to make social change, and if you're interested in social justice, which I think we all are, although we're using very different terminology, we need to find common ground. And there are many, many feminists who agree that there's something very unfair in the system and want to work towards making it better. So I would just like well, hello. I suspect many people in this room, although they may use different terminology. So I would just like to sort of put it on the radar that there are different kinds of feminisms and different kinds of feminists.
When it comes to social justice warrior logic, a lot of it is meant to shut down debate deliberately. So, you know, there are like Soviets, if you look at Russian troll houses, they also have like tactics to go after debate. The best thing is when you know somebody doesn't want to talk to you in a constructive way. If a person is interested in discussing things, they'll talk facts. If they use a moral argument, use a harder moral argument. You know, it's terms of strategy. I found just standing there politely, not, you know, if someone has no manners, standing my ground, unless somebody has facts to discuss, that's the most powerful thing. When it comes to what argument or how this Marxism happens, just one important fact, actually, too. In the United States, 96% of academics are leftist, when only half the population is. They just voted Trump, who's a Republican. Also, over 18% of academics identify as Marxist in the US. Now, also 92% of journalists in the US say they're leftist. The numbers here are higher. So there is a Gramscian, if you will, long march to the left through the institutions. It's a very controversial topic, how exactly the march to the left happened, the march to radical social justice warriors. And what this is Trotskyism. This is radical Marxism. And being half Russian, in the Soviet Union, what Stalin did, he actually cracked down on Trotskyism, which is what these people are promoting. So they went through the back door. Some people feel that, especially coming back to the mental health angle, some people really feel that this will make them feel better, etc., and they fork out money to a lot of these things. People who don't feel so well will fork out money to push, basically to evangelize how they feel.
Go ahead, Greg. It's good. Yep, I'm just.
It's just to add to this question that you said that, yeah, you start to argue facts, bring out numbers, bring out examples and such, and they turn it to a moral debate. You could just turn the morality question back on them. You could say, well, aren't you a hater? You're a hater is what they often say too. You're a racist, you're a sexist, a homophobe, an anti-Semite, whatever they want to throw at you. And said, but aren't you doing the exact same against men? You know, or when I was in Ottawa to see the Red Pill, I went up and talked with some of the people who were protesting it. And none of them had actually seen the movie. And I said, well, maybe as university students, you should actually read the book before you comment on it. So I invited them in, and I offered to pay their ways in. And he said, oh, I'm not gonna. So I've said, so you have a closed mind to it, and that's a form of hatred. And then I said, well, the young man said, I take gender studies. And I said, well, when was the last time you brought forth an issue in gender studies about, say, domestic violence? Oh, well, men are bigger than women. I said, so they're better police officers. No, so they're better soldiers. No, so better firefighters. No. So women can do those jobs, but they're morally better, so they don't do domestic violence. And said, and this boils down to one of the questions I wanted to ask the panel earlier about psychological violence. Two of you had mentioned that psychological violence is far worse than physical violence, and I do agree with that. Because my ex, when I was going through a custody battle, although she did physically harm me sometimes, I'm a big guy, I could put up with it. It was the psychological violence, the constant hanging over your head while you're sleeping, threatening you while you're sleeping, or even better, using the system, using the police, you do as I say, or I'm going to call the police on you, and then you won't see your daughter for months until you sort out. If I say you raped me, you won't see her for 4 months. So either have sex with me, or you don't see your daughter for 4 months. And that's, you know, it's that side of psychological violence. So you could turn that morality question back on them by posing a question. Say, oh, well, you think I'm like this, but what about your hatred? Look at you, you're obviously full of hate here. So does your hatred towards me outweigh what you're saying? And I'm not agreeing to it, but what you're saying, my hatred is towards whatever you say. I'm homophobic, I'm racist, sexist, I'm this, and that. And I watched something on YouTube that just said, a guy just said, prove it. You just called me a racist, prove it. What did I say that was racist? You know, prove it. What did I make? Just prove it, you know? Simple as that. So, yeah, the psychological damage is bad. I'd love to hear about that from you guys.
Did you have a specific question about it? Because I can just confirm that for me, it's, you know, it was a huge deal. It's 13 years later, and I consider myself, I mean, I can talk about exactly what happened in great detail, and I'm okay with it, but I can see where it creeps into my life and like little things that I do. But I just wondered if there was like did you just want someone to acknowledge it, or?
If you guys could expand on that, you know, because like you guys had mentioned, you always see the poster, black eye, visual,
Yeah.
visual communications, great image. However, the woman got it in a rugby game, you know? And I said, good for you, I saw the game, but they put her up as a picture for domestic violence because it was Concordia University and it worked, you know? But see, the thing is, it's the psychological violence and the psychological.
I'm sorry, I'm going to stop you for 1 second because I am not, I took a pill for the flu and my brain is really foggy, so I'm struggling to retain my thoughts, so sorry to interrupt you.
No, go ahead.
But I think you're going to have to refresh my memory then. Go a little bit longer.
Just to expand on your idea that psychological abuse has a longer effect than physical abuse.
Okay, so when I think of psychological abuse and I compare it to women's experiences and men's experiences, there's a little bit of a double standard sometimes that I see. I know a lot of male friends who say things like, my girlfriend won't let me play D&D, or I'm not allowed to go out and do X, Y, or Z. And that's really interesting because if a man said to me, you're not allowed to do that, I know a ton of people who would jump on that and say, well, that's very abusive and that's very controlling. And you know, you gave a couple of examples. When I think of my own experience, the first year of my relationship was amazing. It was, if it ended after the first year, I would say that, you know, that was one of the best relationships of my life. But it's, little things start to crop up, and they're so subtle, and you've got a whole, you know, for me it was a year. I had a whole year of wonderful things that made me want to excuse those away. And they're not as, you know, I'm going to do this to you if you don't do that. That's an extreme example. They start so subtly, and there's no Hollywood movie scene with like daunting music cueing you to the fact that all of these little events are going to accumulate to one day make you doubt your own mind, right? So it's not always that extreme. When it does get to that point, you're already locked in some way. And these examples that I hear from men about what women do, like she checks my phone just because she wants to make sure I'm not cheating on her, and she won't let me talk to my female friends. That would not be acceptable if a man did that to me, and I know a lot of my female friends that would not accept that from their male partners. So why, when women do it, is it sort of either laughed off or accepted in some way? It doesn't make any sense.
One final comment?
Yes. So I lived through war. I lived through being bombed. There was 6 armed men came into my house, and I rumbled them out. I have, I was the undisputed street fighting champion of my neighborhood. I was very good with a gun. I beat a couple lieutenants with a gun. So when it comes to physical violence, that stuff sucks, right? But emotional abuse, this is hard, because physical, you know, if someone hits you, you can hit back. How do you hit back with psychological abuse? It's very, very insidious. And like some of the stuff, when I said no to my boss at that time, the guy who tried to ask me out, and I was like no, and then I wanted to change the office, he said some pretty like things that really shook my confidence for many years. That's kind of my closest to that. But when I have friends who they experience domestic violence, they say it's not the bruises, it's what this person said to destroy the soul. And so this is the fact, and that's why we don't talk about it. But men suffer as much or more than women with the psychological abuse, and it's the psychological abuse that is the most devastating.
Sorry, I do want to make one last point. I do remember very, very clearly the day that the psychological abuse turned into physical abuse, and I was giddy with delight because it was finally tangible. It was finally something that I could stop being so confused about, and I could say, oh my gosh, I can show this to someone. This is real. And that's when I started getting help, because before that I was just, you know, it just messes with your brain so much. So as much as, yes, you know, it's dangerous physically, you know, women are dying, men maybe as well, and that stuff is very serious. The lead up to that was I felt very alone. I had no way of knowing how to identify it. You don't see that.
Well, there we go. Wow. I'm thankful I came tonight. To answer your question about the feminists out there that are trying to find that middle ground and understand both sides in order to be informed, I'm one of them. It was an interesting invite for me, even though I work frontline with men every day, struggling with this innate, systematic barriers that are in place that sometimes are so innate we can't even name them. And I just want to say quickly, I'm so thankful I came tonight. There's so much that I've learned and so much I'm going to be bringing back. And when I post about this on my Facebook and my experience here tonight, I guarantee you, in fact, I would encourage you all to follow me. It should be very interesting to see what the responses will be from many of my colleagues, as well as many of my personal close family and friends. So I say keep the good fight up, and just know that when you do get in front of someone like myself who wants to hear about it, wants to discuss facts, I am guilty of bringing up that moral argument every now and then. But just know that even when they turn you away or call you whatever they want to call you, you can't unhear things. So continue to say and fight and know that what you're doing is about equality and nothing less. So thank you. And I believe David has a little something to add.
Yes, we have a special thing to do for you here. There's a gentleman who wants to give CAFE some money for our upcoming center, and would you come up, Jean-Jacques? Do you want to say something about?
Yeah, certainly. So a couple of months ago or more, I did pledge a certain amount of money for the center, and tonight I'm paying the first part of that. And so here it is. Here you go. And there's still $500 to pay, but that one's going to happen only when it's matched by anybody else out there. So give generously, and once that's matched up, I'm sure I'll follow up with the rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you all for coming, and can we have a final round of applause for all of our panel? if you're not on our mailing list and you want to hear about future events, please see Victor, this gentleman here, to give him your contact information. Thank you and good night.